Good evening and welcome to this session with Dr. Sam Blaxland on exploring grassroots politics, the Conservative Party in Wales since 1945, hosted by the Welsh Political Archive at the National Library of Wales. My name is Rob Phillips. I'm the archivist responsible for the National Library of Wales. It's my pleasure this evening to introduce Sam Blaxland, who's going to speak this evening. Sam's a lecturer in modern history, was born and raised in Pembrokeshire, studied his degree and MA at Cardiff University. Went to Swansea University in 2013 to research and write a PhD thesis, appropriately on the Conservative Party in Wales from 1945 to 1997. He's written several academic, newspaper and think tank articles based on his work, and alongside his research, he lectures and tutors in a variety of undergraduate and postgraduate courses in the history department at Swansea University. He also teaches classes on the theory of oral history and the writing of biographical histories. Various interests include Britain since 1945, including the student protests of the 1960s, grassroots political culture, history of the Conservative Party, Britain's relationships with the European Union, history of Wales, and of party politics of 19th century Britain. He's also written a book on the history of Swansea University. He's a regular contributor to Welsh and British broadcast media on the subjects of historic and contemporary politics, and also hosts Swansea University's major new podcast series exploring global problems. But probably most importantly, he's also a member of the Welsh Political Archive's annual advisory committee, which meets every year and which informs and steers the work of the Welsh Political Archive at the National Library of Wales. And the Welsh Political Archive, for those who don't know, is a programme within the library dedicated to collecting and giving access to all forms of documentary evidence around Welsh politics in the National Library of Wales. We work across departments, so our collections include archives, manuscripts, publications, databases, electronic publications, audio and visual material. More recently, we've started collecting things like podcasts. So it's a very wide and varied collection, and much of the work that Sam will be talking about this evening is based on the archives held at the National Library of Wales. Just a little bit of housekeeping at the start. If you do have any technical problems during the presentation, please could you put a note in the chat, and Nia, who is in the background, will do her best to deal with any technical problems that arise. We will be taking questions at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, could you please pop it in the Q&A on the Zoom function. We're also live streaming on Facebook. Welcome if you're joining us on Facebook. If you do have any questions or comments you'd like to make and you're watching on Facebook, you're welcome to leave them as a comment on the live stream video, and we'll try and pick them from there and discuss them as well. So I think that's all the housekeeping. It's an absolute pleasure to present Sam to do this talk tonight. We've had some interesting discussions while Sam's in the library, looking through the various sources, and I'm really looking forward to hearing it. If you do have any questions, once again, please pop them in the Q&A, or if you're following us on Facebook, pop them in the comments section there, and we'll pick them up as soon as we can. We'll come to some questions at the end of the session. So once again, my pleasure to introduce Sam. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rob. And thank you everybody for coming this evening. I am particularly delighted to be giving this talk. Partly because some of the happiest days of my working life have been involved in making what I consider to be little mini pilgrimages from Haverfordwest or from Cardiff up to Aberystwyth to sit in the South reading room, for days on end, looking through fascinating material, a tiny amount of which, as Rob says, I'm going to try and share with you today. Now, as you can see, my talk is about the Conservatives in Wales. And it's about the party's grassroots. And this is unusual, or it's quite unusual, in two senses. So whilst I'm absolutely not the first historian to focus on the Tory party in Wales, and whilst there have been loads of other political scientists who've spoken on this topic too, or written on this topic, I think it's still fair to say that the party remains understudied. You need to only look at the fact that all the mainstream political parties that have been part of Welsh politics for the past 100 years have full-length books dedicated to their subjects, whereas the Conservatives don't. And yet the Tory party is Wales's second political party. Now, only managing second in Wales when you often manage first in England does speak to the party's weakness here. But second is still significant, and the Conservatives have often gained 30% of the vote at general elections and won a decent number of seats. Those 30% of voters matter, and they're not all just English retirees, as some people would dismiss them as. The more conventional focus on Labour and Plaid in Wales, of course, is legitimate, and it's very understandable. But there is plenty to say on the Tories too. Indeed, they currently have 14 Westminster seats, as many people know, and they're the official opposition in the Senedd. I will be telling this multi-layered history of the party in a book out next year with the University of Wales Press, which has the subtitle From Grassroots to Government, hence the subject of my talk today. Now, the second aspect, therefore, is this unusual focus on the grassroots. When we talk about political parties, in my mind, we should be very much thinking about the many people who, at the local level, played a role in political life by joining constituency associations and giving up their time to support the party. Without supporters, you wouldn't have a party. And yet so much political history is top-down. It focuses on the great men of history. And, in some ways, this is what we instinctively want and what we need to know. We want to know about the big personalities in question, how they gained their positions of power, what they did with that power when they were in office. And biographies are by far the most popular medium of political history. But when you look at some of the most well-known history books on subjects like the British Conservatives, they too tend to be very top-down as well. The approaches of historians like Robert Blake or Maurice Cowlin, subscribe to this idea of the great men theory. And these authors, despite now being long dead, have an impact and people still follow their approach. There has, however, in the works of writers like Tim Bale and Matthew Worley, Stuart Ball, Lewis Mates, Gideon Cohen, and even to some extent in the early works of John Ramsden, there has been a turn towards the grassroots and towards more a focus on more ordinary, typical party members. And one of the main questions that historians ask is simply how many people were members of a political party. It's not an easy thing to find out sometimes, but it's a very simple and important place to start. And in terms of trying to get a handle on this information, the Welsh Political Archive is a goldmine with its reports from constituencies and its enormous amount of minutes books from the constituencies in every corner of Wales. Now, these are just, this is a good start. There we go. These are just some of the membership totals taken from the records that I've read over the years. And some of these figures are absolutely staggering. So, for example, in 1948, in Swansea West, constituency that I know well because it's where I work, you have 350 men who were members of the local Conservative Association, but you've also got 2,450 women. In Barry, in South Wales, which is now basically the new Vale of Glamorgan, the newer Vale of Glamorgan seat, you've got a total in 1951 of 11,000 people who are members of the Conservative Party. 6,000 of them are women, another 2,500 women are in the joint branches of men and women, and then another 2,500 are male members. Now, considering that the electorate in somewhere like this would be sort of 60, 70,000 maybe, that's a huge chunk of the people in somewhere like Barry who are members of the Tory party. On the other end of the spectrum, in solidly anti-conservative places like Merthyr, for example, you've still got, in 1950, 400 people there who are members of the Conservatives. So just simply getting a handle on these figures is quite important. And all of this, of course, is supplemented by really lovely visual imagery from the Political Archive. Pictures from the Jeff Charles collection show that, for example, rallies addressed by the Home Secretary and indeed the First Minister for Welsh Affairs, David Maxwell Fyfe, this chap here, David Maxwell Fyfe, also known as Die Bananas, apparently, brought in huge crowds of supporters, as we can see, to the extent that it was standing room only in these large town halls, in the visual imagery of not just public meetings, but of rallies for party stalwarts and party supporters. And two, we also see images from fetes held at places like Oswestry, which drew in really big crowds. And I know that Oswestry is just over the border, actually in Shropshire, but these kind of meetings were full of activists from constituencies on the other side of the border too. And I'll come back to this particular picture in a moment because it paints 1,000 words. We also learn surprising facts from the Welsh Political Archive about members of political parties in other ways too. I didn't know for a while that there was actually a small but thriving Rhondda Conservative association throughout the 1970s. This is located in a part of South Wales or in one of the South Wales valleys that's almost synonymous with anti-Toryism. And it even appears to have actually been quite successful. It didn't just exist and was moribund for the entire time. They claimed to be sending more young Conservatives, more young people to the big party conferences in places like Llandrindod Wells than any other association in Wales, apparently. And as it says down here, they're claiming that a lot of these people are actually coming from the local Rhondda schools, and they're signing up to the association and they're waving their flags as I guess out and proud Tories. So we learn little nuggets like this and about where there are pockets of Conservative support located in places that you wouldn't quite expect them to be. Now, understandably, the main focus that historians have placed on these members, who you can find evidence of in the archive, is in their capacity as activists. What did they do for the party? How much money could they raise? How effective were they at getting out the vote? Now, I haven't got time to go into the debate here about whether local organisation and sort of manpower, as it were, on the ground matters. Most historians seem to think that it does, and have assumed that even in the age of the mass television campaign, that volunteers knocking on doors and delivering leaflets and broadly advertising the presence of the party to the local area does have some sway in how people vote. There's actually some evidence to suggest that isn't the case, and that it often doesn't make any difference at all. But I'll leave that aside for now, because I think what's important is that grassroots activists thought it mattered. They thought it was important to be members of the party, and so did more senior people higher up in the hierarchy too. And again, you can see evidence from this from across the archive. It's there in the grumpy messages from meetings, such as this one held in the Men's Association in the Riverside Ward of Cardiff West in 1951, which reads that the chairman was again, that word again is quite key here, again expressed his disgust at the meagre attendance of delegates. Although notices have been circulated to delegates, only 3 had sent their apologies, etc. And the Honourable Secretary proposed sending a strongly worded letter to delegates who persistently ignored the meetings. Now, this isn't frustration per se that members aren't being very loyal to the party. It's that they're not offering their services in what's likely to be a general election year. This is June 1951, there's an election in the autumn, which people are very, very much expecting. And this is a marginal seat in Cardiff West, and people are worried that if you haven't got the manpower, you haven't got a means of getting out the vote and advertising the party to people. And it's exactly the thing that's motivating people being stroppy about people not attending meetings and being good Conservatives. Similarly, scenes were witnessed in places like the Penalan men's branch in Cardiff Central, which was actually shut down in 1956 and merged with a women's group because it wasn't efficient enough. And again, here what we have is frustration that people aren't doing the right thing for the party by being active supporters. Now, as you see, both of these examples I've got here are men-only branches. And what's really noticeable about this type of apathy is that it did tend to come from these branches, whereas the women's ones thrived. And we got a sense of that a moment ago when I gave those membership figures, where you just had so many more women active in local politics, or at least members of local politics, than men. Now, the extent to which women members, unlike these men, could be relied on is one of the most striking things from the archival collections. It's important to say, I think, that not everybody who voted for, the Conservatives, for example, became a member. And just in the same way that not everyone who became a member of the party necessarily became an activist. Those 11,000 activists in Barry in 1951 or whenever it was are not all upfront workers of the party. Maybe even only 10% of them are, but that is still a huge number of people who can do quite a lot. And when we look at the archive and when we look at what the women were doing, you can see some really crucial stuff. So we know from scholarship that women were, for most of the post-war period, much more likely to vote Tory, to join the party, and to volunteer as workers for it. And it's impossible, when you look at the records in the archive, not to see again and again the sheer force of Conservative women at the grassroots through this period. One of their most crucial roles was fundraising. something that became especially important in the post-1945 period when a series of reforms altered how local parties were funded, and which also instituted a scheme where money had to be funneled back up to central office through the mechanisms of something called a quota. But basically, raising money was never more important than in the 40s and the 50s. And if we just look at these figures, I've just pulled a couple out just to demonstrate a few things. In 1949, the Conwy Association, so in North Wales, the Conwy Association raised £525 from their ball, £609 from the Conwy Castle Fair, and £691 from their Christmas fair. This is 1949, and we have to bear in mind, this is peak austerity, and these aren't the pounds that I deal in these days. These are, a different kind of pounds. These are enormous sums of money being raised in 1 year by the organisation of women putting together these balls and these fairs, bringing people in and getting them to spend, even in a period, like I say, of real austerity at the end of the 1940s. Just go back one. So, and throughout time, you see this is a really common theme. In 1971, you've got the Monmouth women raising £1,000 from just one fete, the Jubilee. And in 1977, you've got the women of Cardiff North West, a relatively newly created seat, raising £500 just in one pop through a single knit-in event. And this is a common thing over and over again. Quite interesting ways of putting on an event, almost always run by women, staffed by women, where big money comes into the local association. And that means they can keep their association afloat. They can produce things at election times, but they can also fulfill their quota to central office too. And like I said, these are just three examples of literally hundreds that you can see in the archive of active women making money for the party. But in putting on such events, these women also attracted other people to the party. And in doing so, they could fly the Tory banner. They could make the party feel like, in some areas, like part of the communities that they were part of, and which in the process might have made other people voting Tory feel a little bit more socially acceptable, perhaps. They helped also make events fundamentally family-orientated ones. And we can see this again in the wonderful Jeff Charles photos. I think, you've got here a Conservative carnival in Chirk, so near Wrexham, in 1953, packed full of young people. And this isn't something the Conservative Party has tacked onto. This is something that they will have organised explicitly. A carnival with a carnival queen for some of the younger girls. And again, you've got women very much behind this. But this is something that big sections of a community would have fully got behind and got part of. Similarly, I love these photos. Again, they're from the Oswestry fair, but I particularly like this guy giving some children a ride on the model steam railway and himself with pipe in mouth. And here again, you can just you get a real sense of the family occasion on the bottom left, with people sitting on straw bales with the dog. This is a family event organised completely under the auspices of politics and of a political event. This is a Conservative Party event. And I think the social aspect is really important. The historian James Hinton was foremost in arguing that these groups also gave people, and again, usually women, the opportunities to exercise some form, not just of political leadership, but of social leadership as well. And I think this is obvious from the archive again. These women who are at the forefront of organising events, whether it's acting as sort of master of ceremonies for this is actually a dog show that's about to happen at this fete, or whether it's the women in the top right-hand corner in 1916 Bangor sorting out refreshments, very obviously in the rain, shock horror. These are very significant gatherings where women are at the forefront. They don't just make up the majority of the audiences at fetes. They are front and centre, marshalling the events. And in the immediate post-war era, local Tory associations would have given many women who wouldn't have been in work a purpose and something to get involved with that didn't relate to domesticity, especially if they saw what they were doing as broadly for a good cause or for the right cause, which I think is what we see here. Again, the fusion of politics and of social life. Okay, so far then, all of this is relatively typical. It's pretty much what we'd expect to find from material in the archive, and the type of stuff that the more recent generation of historians who've looked at political grassroots, it's what they expect to find, it's what they look for, and it's what they write about. However, I think we can extend what we do with all of this material. Instead of asking what this tells us about activists as party workers, or indeed as leadership figures, what can it tell us more broadly about middle-class culture in Wales and about those people, these people, all of these people, or some of them at least, as individuals, as members of civic society, and indeed as small c conservatives, not party representatives per se, but as small c conservatives with thoughts, opinions, or ideas that extended well beyond party politics. And this is particularly interesting for Welsh history too, because it's so often, and understandably, absolutely understandably, but so often dominated by discussions of working class culture, of trade unionism, and the politics of labour with a big and a small L. So all of this requires a bit more thought, care, and indeed reading between the lines. An element of nuanced speculation might have to come in, but this is what good history often involves. So I'd like to use the rest of this talk, which will still go on for quite a while, but the rest of this talk to illustrate some of the ways in which my book will pose some of those questions about the wider sort of social and cultural landscape of middle-class Wales, I guess, using the Welsh Political Archive at the forefront of my analysis. Now, first, I think it's worth highlighting the specific nature of middle-class culture that was involved in most Tory associations. The Tory vote in Britain and in Wales was never exclusively middle class or upper middle class. The party could never have won seats like Conway in 1951 or Swansea West in 1959 or Bridgend in 1983 if it was the case that it was solely relying on middle class votes. Working class conservatism is a thing. It's a thing in Wales, perhaps less so than England, certainly, but it still is a thing in Wales. And the working class vote is important for the party. But the membership of the political parties was much more resolutely middle class. There are lots of reasons for this. Think membership fees, think the time that's required to devote to politics, and think about a certain kind of confidence and security needed to join something that badges you as something and badges you as political. But associational culture almost certainly reinforced all of this, by which I mean that existing attitudes or behaviours that existed within local conservative groups, were there when people joined, and they would have stayed once people joined. If we sort of go back to this picture, which I like in particular, it's 1949, and I think it just says so much about the people who turned out here. You wouldn't think that 1949 was a real period of hardship in huge swathes of Britain and Wales from looking at this particular picture. Look at how people are turned out. Look at the dress. And we can look at things like the age profiles of lots of the audience here. There are lots of older people, but it is sort of cross-generational. That tells us something very interesting. It's almost certainly still quite formal, or this is still a very formal period in our recent history. But it's worth asking the question: are these people in this picture the so-called gin and tonic and Jaguar set that the Western Mail once identified Tories in Wales as being? Or take, for example, the Monmouth seat. For much of the 20th century, Monmouth had a particular habit, actually, this is what I seem to have found, of organising large-scale social events that would essentially have been very costly and almost certainly would in turn have felt exclusive because of their costs. This whole idea of, oh, aren't you coming to this outing? Just looking at this leaflet, for example, which does date back to 1929, slightly beyond my period, but you'll see why I've gone back that far in a moment. 1929, the period, a period as we know isn't quite into the Depression, but it still comes with all those particular interwar circumstances. It's a trip to London. It involves train travel, luncheon, a tour of Parliament, and a showing of a show called Lumber Love at the Lyceum. So there's expense involved in all of this too. And just as a side note, what I love about these, this is on the face of it something advertising the programme for an outing for the Monmouth Conservative Association, but they never miss a trick to just sort of add in here, wake up, Monmouth Division, and assist in defeating the socialists and the communists. This is 1929. We're heading towards the first kind of minority Labour government. You can see that there's that kind of worry, but also that need to come on. Yes, you can go to London, but also get out there and start campaigning for us too. That's important. Coming up to sort of my period, in the 10 years after the war, the Monmouth, again, it's mainly the Monmouth women associations, organised various trips from the constituency that involved things like meals in pleasant restaurants, shows at the West End, and visits to things like the Ideal Homes exhibition. In 1955, in 1955, the Monmouth Tories organised a trip to Paris and the Netherlands. That is something which would not have been common. Foreign holidays in this period would have been both beyond the economic reach and indeed the mental horizons of many people. It's a personal anecdote, but my grandparents were around in the 1950s and they never went abroad in their lives, let alone in the 1950s to Paris. And this is a solidly middle-class, wealthy group of people whose instincts not only to go on these places and to spend the money, but also to explore are obviously strong enough for them to travel well just beyond London. By 1972, when overseas travel, of course, is more common, if not very common, you've got the association organising trips to Mallorca, Rome, and Paris in the space of 1 year. So the Monmouth Tories were really sort of went places. But again, this reinforces that politics and socialising were often indistinguishable from one another. You went, to the Conservative Association for the rallies, and you stayed for the long weekends in Rome. But also, I'm not being frivolous. This does allow us to ask really fundamental questions about the nature and the spread of wealth, about ideas of status, and also about ideas of identity too. And because I've got so much to say today, I'm not going to sort of drill down into any of these things. Particularly, I want to sort of say a broad range of things, and maybe I can expand on them later. Evidence from the same Monmouth constituency also shows that engagement in local political events could also be part of a wider civic or charitable life. And this clipping comes from one of the dozens of scrapbooks held in the archives. And just sort of a side note, the scrapbooks like this, which are often this thick and are just completely full of clippings plastered in by some wonderful soul back in the day, if they find their way to an archive, these are the historian's dream. Because instead of someone like me having to just go through all the hard copies or the digitized copies of all the newspapers from a period, someone has come along and found all the stuff that or broadly all the stuff I want, and put it together in one place for me. And this is an example of many. In fact, I've spent quite a lot of my time recently when I've been chatting to Rob, telling him all about the latest scrapbook finds that I found. These are absolutely wonderful. But in this particular one, I think this photo paints 1,000 words. And every time I look at it, I can't help it. I just love the expression on Mrs. E. Hawkins's face here. I just think that's really wonderful. I can't tell if she's just really chuffed to be there, or slightly intimidated, or just someone had said something, perhaps. But the accompanying text around the photograph, in this case, is really important too. We have here, like I said, a joint charitable do, joint with the British Empire Cancer Research Campaign, no less. And these kind of things were quite common, the fusing of political activity with what would have more commonly be called, without the negative connotation, do-gooding. This is a prime example of do-gooders. But we've also got here a minor celebrity coming and being part of the political scene. This is the jazz musician Kenny Ball, as well as, what have we got? We've got women prominent. We see that women are prominent in the accompanying text. There's a certain kind of dress style, obviously, but there's the fact that the event was held in a golf club. That speaks for itself. But also, again, all the stalls, all the organizational stuff that's happening at this event are, again, manned, no pun intended, by those described in the clipping here as madames. Okay. So the final thing I'd like to turn to is to sort of move away from this idea of broader civic middle class life, which you can really, I've just shown a couple of examples there about how you can really start to dig down and ask what activists thought. What did they believe? What was their worldview on stuff? And here you might be thinking, well, he's going back to the politics, but that's not really what I'm intending to do, because what I'm trying to do here is not talk about necessarily the headline conservative policies that people subscribe to, but what was their broader life outlook? What motivated them to be political? And archives like this, I'm sure Rob won't mind me saying, can actually be frustratingly vague on what people thought. Minute books, for example, brilliant sources, heavy sources sometimes, literally and metaphorically. they are brilliant, but sometimes they're the most irritating documents possible, because they'll note that, for example, a long discussion followed some sort of controversial comment or whatever, and it won't note anything about that discussion. And it may say, there was no resolution. And the historian is left almost crying out for the details of an argument that we've nearly got to. We've got 90% of the way there. We've found that moment, and we want to know what happened. And yet it doesn't tell us what people said or what they actually thought. So that can be very frustrating. However, if we look hard enough, we can see the sort of things that we are looking for. The most obvious one of these is things like resolutions to party conferences, or also just what local associations wanted to see or what they thought was important. What did they want debated at the big yearly and annual event that the Tories had? And resolutions that they sent were meant to convey the feeling of a group as a whole. But what I find most interesting is often the way in which these groups have clearly debated stuff, and you can sometimes see that they voted on it and that the vote has been quite evenly spread. What were they thinking? There obviously wasn't just a view on this matter. There was a whole range of views amongst people who were already quite political already. There must have been some very fiery discussions. Anyway, we can see here, for example, that one Valley's seat, understandably and very interestingly, thought that the key pressing issues at the end of the 1970s were youth unemployment, school standards, didn't want devolution. We've got a devolution referendum coming up in 1979, obviously. They are very keen on the sale of council houses, and they're also keen, surprise, surprise, on winning over old Labour voters. Those are the top priorities. Now, perhaps the most interesting ones about sort of motions sent from constituencies to the party conference are usually on the issue of race, frankly, and particularly Enoch Powell. Enoch Powell engendered a huge amount of, or a huge variety of thought and opinions amongst the Conservative grassroots. And here we've got the Chepstow area of the Monmouth constituency again, saying that that we are dismayed by the lack of support accorded. This is 1960, and this might well be 1968, which is the year of the River of Blood speech, or maybe 1969. But they're saying, we are dismayed by the lack of support accorded by Conservative spokesman to Mr. Enoch Powell's recent speeches on the immigration problem. It is felt that these speeches have expressed the feeling of the average British citizen, and the misrepresentation, misreporting in the British press and other media have suggested a rift in the Conservative Party policy. But when you see this, and this was sent, but then you also see that there was a lively debate about it. And actually, this resolution was only passed by 24 to 19 votes. It was a much more tightly sort of a contested thing. Some abstentions even. So views about how Powell was being represented are different even within the Chepstow area part of Monmouth. Very, very interesting as well, going back to the Rhondda Conservative Association. You've got a completely different tone. And this is in the sort of mid-70s. So a little bit of space separating the two things here, but still, in a period where Enoch Powell was being hugely lauded by a lot of the Conservative right. You've got the Rhondda Conservative Association actively trying to encourage Anglo-Asian associations and Anglo-West Indian associations, and saying the full integration of all members of our multiracial society is key, and we must get this message across to immigrants. Not what you necessarily would expect in mid-1970s Conservative associations, but just the difference between these two, even though they're a few years apart, is quite striking. And maybe it says something different about a Monmouth association and a Valleys association, perhaps. Incidentally, the man who was behind the Rhondda branch and who stood for Parliament a few times for the Rhondda constituency was a guy called Peter Lyshan. And he made the pages of the Times and the Daily Telegraph for being quite critical of Enoch Powell at Conservative Party conference. If anybody knows anything more about Peter Lyshan, please tell me, because I have struggled to find much about him, and that's always really bothered me. So if anybody here knows, I'd love to hear. Now, another wonderful way in which we get this glimpse into what grassroots Tories really felt about broader issues is things like the letters that they wrote to their MPs, a tiny fraction of which have been saved by those more diligent record keepers, as Rob and I would call them, although hoarders, as other people would probably say. But at the same time, we've got to be careful as historians that one letter expressing the view on one issue isn't evidence of a whole swathe of public opinion. And I'm guilty of sometimes saying that it is. when it isn't. Much more effective are things like constituency questionnaires, a device that became much more popular as politics became increasingly democratized with the voice of the people in being encouraged to be heard more and more throughout the 20th century within sort of local associations, this idea of engaging with your members as opposed to just being their member who never visits the seat. And in the archive, you have, although some of them I must admit are still under the 30-year rule or under lots of data protection issues, so you can't always look at everything, but you have hundreds of respondents being asked the same question or the same set of questions, and with many of them, when they return their questionnaires to their MP, annotating in huge detail the questionnaires themselves. And what these reveal aren't just the kind of the trends and the patterns of what people are thinking on certain issues. They demonstrate in some cases a real and quite deep intellectual engagement with the issues of the day, as well as of course you do get the more traditional hang 'em and flog 'em kind of sentiment that you would expect, but it's very rarely just like that. And on this note, I want to take just one last example of something from the archive, which again I found quite recently, and I loved spending my time trawling through. It's a questionnaire sent out by Nicholas Bennett, the MP for Pembrokeshire from 1987 to 1992, who succeeded Nicholas Edwards, with two Nicks in Pembrokeshire. And that's the header of the questionnaire that he was sent out. I can't show the actual questionnaires because there's so much data protection problems. I can't show you, but that's kind of what they look like. And what I'm going to do here is just to try and show how rich this material really can be. I'm not going to share anything, like I say, but I'm going to summarize what these questionnaires said in my own words. Now, bear in mind, this exercise was conducted in 1990, just before Margaret Thatcher left office, and there's an economic downturn looming. And I was just about to be born in a hospital in Haverfordwest, incidentally, but that's not why I've chosen this to focus on. But it is because I'm from Pembrokeshire that I particularly like this set of questionnaires. So here we go. What happened was Bennett gave everybody who was sent this questionnaire, and by the way, these aren't just the members of the public, they are Tory members, Tory activists. He asked people to rank in importance the top 10, or he gave them 10 issues and said, rank these in importance of what you think is the most important, 1 being the most important, 10 being the least important. So what I've done, which was quite time consuming, is add all the responses up and then divided them by the number of responses, which when you come out with people in Pembrokeshire or conservative activists in Pembrokeshire in 1990 thought perhaps broadly what we would expect them to think, which is that inflation is the greatest concern. The cost of what used to be called the cost of living, the how much it costs to buy things and how the wage packet is being reduced as a result. Quite close on inflation's tail is law and order. Again, that's quite a typical conservative concern. And then you've got health, education, the environment, by which, in 1990, what we really mean here is probably green spaces, maybe animal welfare, more than how we'd understand it now. Social care, housing, unemployment, not very high at all. That's sort of indicative perhaps of this being a Tory association. And very strikingly, defence and foreign affairs right down the bottom, not being particularly important in the eyes of local Tories. And again, that might be a Pembrokeshire thing, end of the line and all that. Now, Bennett then asked people for more specific answers on particular questions. So, do you think it should be taxed more? 30% of the people responding said yes. 70% said that there should be less tax. Relatively typical Tory responses there. Should more things be nationalised? If you think about this is the period where the railways isn't quite in private hands yet. Most people saying there should be less nationalisation, but there's quite a lot of people who are quite happy with the balance that had been struck by the end of the 1980s. Some people want more. That's broadly what I would expect. I'd also broadly expect, should the death penalty be reintroduced for murder? This is something you see decade in, decade out amongst Conservative voters and others, I should say, overwhelmingly in favour of the return of hanging by the neck until dead for the crime of murder. 88% of people. So those are the kind of responses that I would broadly expect. But when other questions are asked, I think these are fascinating. Bennett asks people, should the Sunday trading laws be relaxed, be deregulated? And almost the vast majority of people saying yes, they should. limited opening, sort of short limited opening on some trainings only gone as 11%, and the idea of closing shops on Sunday, which to my mind might have been a small C conservative viewpoint, doesn't garner much support either. A very telling indicator of how the debate is almost totally flipped on its head amongst conservative grassroots supporters is, again, not quite overwhelming, but a very strong support, very in favour, 63% very in favour of the creation of a single European market, with only 7% saying it's not important. There is then also some very badly worded questions on the Welsh language, which fuse Welsh language stuff and devolution, so you can't really read a huge amount into them. But you've got the majority of people probably understandably saying that when it comes to Welsh identity, that Wales is an integral part of the UK, and that's how they want to see it. But you have got people saying that the Welsh language needs further protection, that the status quo by the end of the 1980s, when a huge amount of change had happened in the status of the Welsh language, that was good, and some people even wanting a devolution referendum. So these are fascinating. We can read a lot into them as we can. I'm not going to read all these out, but this is just a flavour of some of the annotations on these questionnaires that, like I say, move us away from the black and white yes and no responses of questionnaires, which make them not particularly useful sources. This is where you get the real meat of the stuff, which is that you've got people saying yes, or saying no, I don't think that privatisation is particularly good, but industry should be run efficiently. They need to be run in a particular way. You can't leave everything to private enterprise. The government needs to do certain things. There's a moral challenge in this country, but I've studied Japan, and I think the Japanese society is much better. Things about leadership. You've got things like this. Mrs. Thatcher has done wonders for this country, but the present government has created a less than caring society. So people on one hand think she's been brilliant, but also that obviously been good in some ways and bad in others. You've got support for Enoch Powell. You've got this idea that we're too tied to the USA and that Britain needs to come to terms with the fact that it's not a world power. And then you've got more sort of stock, typical conservative answers. But all of these questionnaires are almost all of them are very heavily annotated with people expressing what they really thought. And if you try and weave this together, you've got a sort of a tapestry, a picture of what people at the beginning of the 90s who were active Tories thought about the broader world. And then, of course, you naturally as well do have the very common complaints, which all politics is local. I wish to live in Pembrokeshire rather than Dyfed. I don't want this radar base at St David's. The area is filthy. And of course, my favourite, no stamp provided, please refund 15p. Okay, this has been a bit of a whistle-stop tour. But in conclusion, I tried to draw material for this talk today from a tiny sections of the Welsh Political Archive. I've only touched lightly upon a few things, more to try and show the potential of the archive more than anything else. Keen observers who've been to the archive and looked through it will note that nothing came from the amazing ephemera collection, for example. This has all been a bit more black and white, literally, with its minute books and its newspaper clippings. I've also not mentioned records from conservative clubs or really said anything about youth branches. And what about all the personal collections that the archive has, like that of Kathleen Smith, who was an author, but also a former parliamentary candidate for Carnarvon, and a prominent activist up in Northwest Wales too. Some fantastic stuff there. But I hope I've shown that even within the dusty and sometimes innocuous pages of the kind of documents that I've shown today, or in those many pictures from the Jeff Childs collection, that you can see clues from a whole range of sort of ideas and subject matters that have thus far received relatively little attention in the political history of Wales and Britain. And it's my hope, therefore, that I can make, and come back to me, that I can make a really significant contribution to both of these fields in my book, part of which will expand upon and explore what I've spoken about today, although it'll also do the great men and the ministers and the governing of Wales as well in this period. Just final word, at my book's heart will be the material that I've gathered from the Welsh Political Archive over the course of nearly 10 years, as well as, it has to be said, a wealth of material from the Conservative Party's archive in Oxford too. It won't be the book it's going to be without this collection, and I should say that the enormous help I've had over the years from the staff at the National Library, and especially to Rob, has been invaluable. Now I've just got to finish writing it. But ideas, pointers, anything is greatly received. That's the way that we learn and we make things better. So thank you very much indeed for coming today and for sitting through that. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Sam. That was absolutely fascinating. I know we discussed a number of the things that you mentioned in the talk whilst you were visiting, and it was really great to see those. So thanks very much for that, and for the sort of taking us through not just the archive material, but I think the photographs as well, which do really speak volumes about the kinds of events and about the kind of society that was built up then around sort of the activities of the Conservative and Unionist Association. I actually think it's quite telling that of course that they were using the term Unionist Association rather than Conservative Association quite recently. I appreciate it was something that was certainly the case Second World War, but it seems to be much more common than I was expecting after the Second World War. It's something perhaps you associate more with Scottish politics than Welsh politics.
Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, no, they do it, and that's a good point. I should bring that out more.
If there are any questions, please pop them in the Q&A at the bottom of the screen, or if you're on Facebook, pop them in the Facebook comments, and I will I'll happily read them out. There's nothing there yet, but if anyone wants to add something, please do. So I've got a few things I'm going to ask, but if there's any other thoughts and comments, even if they're just comments rather than questions, then please put them in, because it would be interesting to share them. I was going to comment on myself the visibility of women in the associations, which I think is really important, and it's something that's just totally not reflected in the elected representatives, not just the Conservatives, but of all the major parties in Wales over the last half century. We acquired a few years ago the minute books of the North Wales Liberal Association, Women's Liberal Association, and that once again showed the importance of women in the at some grassroots level, doing fundraising, but organising as well. It's fundraising. There's a lot of it about organising and creating this sort of society that then came together to work at election time and to create votes. So I think that's a really important point. I'm just wondering if you see anything there. I mean, the polls do sometimes show that support amongst women is higher amongst women for Conservatives perhaps than it is for some other parties. I'm just interested to hear your take on that, and how you think that folds over into obviously the Conservatives having the first woman Prime Minister, but until very recently less representation perhaps at council and parliamentary level, and also in the Assembly as well. Yeah.
I realised I should have been writing down some thoughts while you were making all those really interesting points, because otherwise I'll lose my train of thought. But you're right that obviously in 2019 was the first time that you get any women MPs from Wales. What's really, in some ways, the Tory party, I guess, gets off lighter with this amongst its own members and activists, because for quite a lot of the period that I study, most women activists are perfectly happy with this situation. They don't mind that this is a reasonable state of affairs, that men are largely the MPs, and that women do a lot of the work on the ground. Now, they don't see that in their eyes as drudgery or as kind of backroom irrelevant stuff. They believe and think it's really important. And a lot of them, well, not a lot, but there are very, very interesting figures, people like, there's one woman who was very active in Carmarthen circles called Hilda Prothero Beynon. And there was another called Kathleen Everest in South Wales, who used to really go out on the campaign trail. They were forceful, really keen women who people used to say, "Why are you not wearing a hat?" But they just, "I don't need a hat for campaigning," kind of attitude. But even they didn't sort of understand politics in the feminist kind of mold that we would understand politics now. But they understood it. It made sense to them, and it wasn't contradictory to them. And they didn't see that you couldn't be a political woman, you couldn't be an important political woman, but that it just wasn't the role you did as an MP. And MPs' wives played a very, very significant role. Peter Thornycroft's wife was extremely prominent in Monmouthshire politics, for example, when he was the MP there. So yeah, it's in some ways the kind of, and not anti-feminism, but the sort of idea that women thought about women's roles in politics was pretty conducive to how politics worked for the vast majority of the 20th century, and people were happy with it. Unlike when you've got from sort of the 1970s with Labour, a very small number again of women MPs, although they do actually have some. They had Irene White in the 50s and 60s, for example, and Anne Clwyd from 1984, or 1984. But again, there's a lot more of a fierce debate going on in Labour circles between sort of old-fashioned traditional trade unionists' voices in some senses and the new wave, second wave feminism is saying we need more women's representation. That's not happening so much here. But I think what's really key here is it's that organizational and social leadership that you sort of implied with your question, Rob, about the liberal associations as well. It's that playing a really key role in and making a difference in important ways. And sometimes that sort of intersects with the whole charitable and civic life, like that thing I said about that function. And like I say, it's conducive to Tory politics. And when it comes to Thatcher, she sort of made sense to them as well, because while she very heavily played up in some ways her womanhood and being a woman and being a mother and being a housewife, she was also fundamentally kind of difficult to place on all that kind of stuff. She didn't stay at home any longer than she needed to with her twins and all that kind of stuff. Because she was such a forceful personality, the fact that her expression of her womanhood didn't really make sense to a lot of people was kind of by the by. It's all very, very interesting.
And thank you. A point to come in, which actually overlaps with something I was thinking of as well, which is you mentioned that women took the lead on fundraising events and gave some examples like dances, fete, and knitting. I wondered how far these were quite gendered activity, whether they indicate something different.
They are quite. That's a great question. Thank you. They are quite gendered activities. Things like the knittings were pitched deliberately to women. And the only reason they could get away with doing that because they knew they could get 500 quid from it, because there was that huge, there was that bulk of female supporters who would come to the events. But they're not always gendered. If anything, it's things like the dances, things like the very common are whist drives. I have to admit, I've never played whist. I don't know how whist works, but you see whist drives all the time, and that's not gendered at all. That's played by men and women across the board. What's probably worth pointing out here is that I didn't say anything about conservative clubs, but a lot of the male membership, not a lot, but a significant proportion of the conservative male membership at the Grassroots are members of conservative clubs. And conservative clubs are almost exclusively male only. And they're male only spaces, and they have their own sort of social life, and it's hardly political at all, but it sometimes does intersect with politics. So that's your male domain in some ways. So it's almost as if there is this sort of side thing with or sort of side domain that women can utilize by knittings. And I'm trying to think of other very specifically gendered ones. There are comic, dog shows. There's not very much that's sport orientated. You don't get you get fly fishing competitions sometimes, but you don't get very kind of particularly masculine sport related things. In the what becomes funny if you get absolutely sucked into the archives, and I know you'll get this feeling, Rob, you end up feeling like you are living with these people. You are there sometimes in the room with them. You can hear them. You can sort of, and because you've got the dust coming up from you, can almost smell the room and all that kind of stuff. And so you're 1 minute you're in the 1950s and it's whist drives and it's kind of knittings or whatever, and then suddenly you go to the late 80s or late 90s and the women have booked a stripper, but again, for the women, it's a very, very specific women thing, and you just can't. These women don't book strippers. Oh yes, they do, because I'm now looking at something from 1988 or whatever it is.
Which association was that, Sam? I think we need to go into those records in a lot of depth to see what's going on.
Yeah, that's Cardiff West, I want to say, and actually there's even documentary evidence of it. There is film evidence of a stripper with a mullet, very sort of very period, and the room is just full of older ladies in very traditional dress saying, well, I've just come for a bit of a laugh really with the girls, and it's just brilliant. But it is specifically, they booked out the I think the Grangetown Conservative Club for a stripper.
That is really how to blow a stereotype out of the water there, I think.
Absolutely.
That's amazing. I've got another question coming now, asking were there sharp geographic contrasts in the size of association memberships? The notable figures you cite at the beginning all seem to be from South Wales.
Yeah, that's a good point. And well done for picking me up on that, for not doing the geographical spread. This is something when I'm writing my book, I'm thinking, oh God, I need to be as broad as possible. The answer is yes. The big membership figures are in the following: Pembrokeshire, Swansea West, all the Cardiffs. Cardiff is very, very conservative in terms of its support levels up until the end of the 1980s. Monmouth, Brecon and Radnor is very, very, very highly big numbers. But of course, because it's such a huge constituency, you often don't get them all coming together. So you get lots of branches in places like Brecon and Radnor. But also some of the most well-attended Tory associations are in Denbigh, West Flintshire, and Conwy. So the Peter Thomas seat, and then the Wyn Roberts seat. And then this always tests my general knowledge, but the Sir Anthony Mayor, Geraint Morgan's seats in Denbigh from sort of 1959 to 1983, huge numbers. So there is a geographical spread, and those are the areas. Let's be frank about this. Put it straight out there. When you look at Dennis Balsam's old 3 Wales model, and it shows you British Wales, which is the areas I've just said, Welsh Wales, which is the South Wales Valleys, where Rob hails from, and then the Fro Gymraeg, which is the kind of the Welsh-speaking heartland. The membership is clustered very significantly in the British Wales bit, the bits that I've just talked about, and you don't get many members at all in Welsh Wales, in the South Wales Valleys. Although when you do find that there were kind of 50 women regularly attending something in Ebbw Vale, I'm not a Tory. I'm not a Conservative supporter. But you even feel a need to kind of go, oh, good for you. That's a Nyron Bevan's seat. It's a Nyron Bevan seat, and you are coming out in the open and saying, we're having a Tory meeting here. Come and join us if you want. And I think there's a tiny bit of bravery involved there.
So I think that the 3 Wales model, it's been debunked to some extent, but there's definitely an element of truth in there, because it does reflect in a lot of voting patterns. And I think that's fascinating.
The 2019 general election is the 3 Wales model.
Yeah. It's surprising how close it is in so many levels.
Apart from this one.
Apart from this one, of course, but this one's always been a little bit of a difficult one. Difficult one to tackle. I've got another couple of questions. They're coming in thick and fast now. Thank you for actually fascinating talk. Do you see any overlap between the gin and tonic and Jaguar set and women's professional organisations in the period, or did you get the sense that the women involved in grassroots considered activism would have been housewives?
That's a really good question. I think there is some overlap. I think there's probably quite a lot of overlap, actually. When you look at things like the NFU, or whatever the forerunner of the NFU was, the sort of farmers' union and everything like that. That woman I mentioned a minute ago, Hilda Prothero Bainan, the Carmarthen lady, was also she was the patron of the local scouts or guide. Sorry, it would have been guide, the Girl Guides. It's this kind of. I would make a distinction in answering that question between the sort of leadership, the women leadership figures who are very involved in, not often in local government, but in other sort of civic pride related organisations. Never as much as the men. Incidentally, you often get the people who are the British Legion head the British Legion for their local area and all that kind of stuff. But the further you go down, you do find, or I seem to find anyway, that it is kind of a more housewifely culture. But so I would make the distinction between those two things, and it depends place by place. But the thing I've got to not get carried away with sometimes is thinking that just because people were attending a few meetings, that they were automatically then pounding the streets, pounding the pavements, and making stump speeches. The more likely you seem to be to do that and be really active, the more likely you were part of wider civic life and civic society. Is my instinct.
And I'll go over. There's another question. Thank you for a really interesting talk. Conservative Party is viewed as a highly centralised organisation in terms of decision making, etc. Does the research support this, or is there evidence of local branches having an impact on party policy?
Thank you, Ellen. Fab question. The Tory Party has the least influence on actually feeding up ideas about party policy to its kind of hierarchy, up the hierarchy, up to its kind of betters than any other party. Most parties are better at doing it than they are. So the extent to which the grassroots influence policy or help make policy is pretty negligible. Absolutely. On the other hand, however, when it comes to things like their own fundraising, when it comes to things like organising themselves, they are all sometimes hilariously independent, as in they will refuse to give the basic information to central office if it's been asked, because we have autonomy over what we do here. And it's really interesting that they see a distinction between those two. They don't mind not being policymakers, but they don't want anyone telling them where they're meant to be holding their fate or whatever. And one of the reasons we don't have very accurate membership figures for lots of the constituencies is precisely because they wouldn't even give those numbers. Now, perhaps that's because they were ashamed of their numbers in some ways and they didn't want to admit how few people were coming. But there's evidence that there were loads of people in constituencies and they were just refusing to give the numbers because it was basically, you can jog on. So you're right, in some ways, the Tory party is very centralised. It is when it comes to decision-making and policy-making, but it also, for a lot of this period, it was keen to sort of decentralise decision-making in other areas, and this idea of power trickling down to local areas, this idea that devolution could be done just not on a national basis but on kind of regional basis or local town hall bases, sort of applies to the grassroots as well. You've got the country divided into 12 regional areas, and Wales is one regional area, which is useful for our purposes, although it doesn't make a lot of sense in some ways because it's all bits of Wales are very different to one another. And you've got someone in charge of Wales, the regional agents, but they just spend their whole time despairing about how people aren't listening to them or doing what they're told. So there is a huge element of autonomy on to some extent, but not in the way that kind of you implied. But what's interesting is people don't seem to be that bothered, because I think there is this sense of deference. I think that's the word I was probably scrambling for there. There's a sense of deference that the grassroots don't make policy. That's not what they're for.
I think that fits in quite well with your comments about the women in these organisations just seeing their role as organising, fundraising, supporting, rather than getting involved in the sort of politics. It's fascinating. There's another question, but I got one I'm going to ask, which picks up on a point you said about the minute books being very frustrating, some of the archives, because you don't hear what the individuals actually thought. Sometimes you get a sort of a there. What can we do about that? What do we need to do to try and plug that gap? Because it's bad enough that it's there in the past, but I'd really don't want to be in a position in 50 years' time where someone's doing a history of the Conservative Party in Wales in the first 30 years of devolution and making the same complaints. What can I do? What can we do? Try and make sure that those voices are captured.
I mean, as someone who very briefly took minutes for organisations, I know that this is what you do. Like this is the nature of minute taking, isn't it? You're not meant to detail this kind of stuff, and in some ways it's private. So I totally understand why it's done. What I do, it's sort of retrospectively, historically, to try and fill the gaps, and I do it very deliberately, is two things. I talk to the people who were there. I interview now very elderly people. I did a big oral history project for the PhD work that's funneling into this book. Spoke to a lot of people who are now dead, including very senior, significant grassroots figures who were in their 90s at the time. And sort of, no one can remember a specific meeting, but you can sort of ask, what was the kind of feeling there at the time, all that kind of stuff. So you can ask people, and if it's modern history, you can do oral history, and you can make sure you get in early and do your oral histories in advance. And the other thing, not so possible now, I guess, but was possible in, for example, the 1950s, in the heyday of the local press, is you can look at what these people are often saying when they complain and write to the local papers in the form of letters to the editor and stuff like that. It's amazing how often you will find particular names, because they are the types to voice their opinions in the press, will be writing and putting their oar in about various kinds of stuff. So they're my ways in which I, as a historian, try and go about plugging those gaps. But it can be, I've had some really almost kind of traumatic experiences of finally tracking down the meeting where the decision that I really need to link something or to put the final piece of the jigsaw in, and there's just no explanation there. If it's not there, it's not really going to be anywhere else. So it can be almost traumatizing sometimes, and when you've traveled all the way to an archive and managed to locate the right book and then finally found where the conversation is happening. But yeah, it's a great question about plugging it, Rob, and I think I'm a huge advocate of oral history stuff. I love it, and I love speaking to people. So, but it takes time and money and resources to do oral history projects, and yeah, well, yes, ...
Indeed. But that's brilliant. Well, just thank you again. I've really enjoyed this evening, and it's been great to have the discussion and people asking questions. I think there may well be another book there for you, perhaps specifically on women in the Conservative Party in Wales, I don't know, at some point. Two things before we go. I just want to do a quick plug for the Welsh Political Archives annual lecture, which is going to take place on Tuesday, November the 2nd. That's with the Pier Heading, Cardiff at 6:30. Being given by Professor Paul O'Leary of Aberystwyth University on Lloyd George Empire and the founding of Bodden Island. That's going to be a really good event. Tickets are available on the from the National Library website before too long, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And also, if you'd like to share some feedback about the event this evening, then there's an online survey that's been shared in the chat. Just click on the link there and that'll take you to the survey. We'd really appreciate hearing your views on that. But can I just once again thank you, Sam, for a really interesting talk this evening.
Thank you, Rob.
And for the research. They're looking forward to seeing the book. And thank everyone else for taking part, for contributing questions and for listening this evening.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
So good night all. Thank you very much for coming.